Hello there, and welcome back to another journey through history's quieter corners, where the past whispers its strangest secrets if you know how to listen. Tonight, we're stepping into a world that feels both impossibly distant and uncomfortably familiar. A time when the line between healing and harming was drawn not in ink, but in blood, sweat, and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this time the cure wouldn't be worse than the disease. Picture this. You're lying in bed, fever burning through your body like fire through dry kindling. Your family has called for help, and soon you hear footsteps approaching, the rustle of robes, the clink of metal instruments. Relief washes over you because the doctor has arrived. But here's the thing that might make your skin crawl just a little. In medieval Europe, that approaching footstep might very well be the sound of your death walking toward you, dressed in scholarly robes and carrying the very best intentions. This is the story of medieval medicine, a tale so absurd, so tragically misguided, and yet so earnestly pursued that it reads like dark comedy written by history itself. These weren't evil men lurking in shadows with malicious intent. No, these were learned scholars, devoted healers, men who spent years studying ancient texts and observing the human body, all while accidentally becoming some of the most efficient killers of their age. They believed they were saving lives. They were convinced their methods were sound. And with every patient they treated, they were, more often than not, hastening death with the confidence of absolute certainty. Before we dive into this medical horror show, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something beautifully ironic about the fact that while we're discussing an age when a simple cut could mean death, you're probably lying somewhere safe and warm with access to medical knowledge that would seem like pure magic to a medieval physician. If this kind of historical deep dive is your idea of the perfect bedtime story, I'd be grateful if you tapped that like button or subscribed. It helps this quiet little channel reach other curious minds who enjoy their history served with a side of existential unease. So settle in, dim the lights if you can, and let your thoughts slow to the pace of a medieval monastery bell. Because we're about to explore a time when the very people entrusted with preserving life had mastered, quite by accident, the art of ending it. And the most chilling part, they never knew. When we think of medieval doctors, our minds often conjure images of wise men with long beards, mixing mysterious potions in candlelit chambers. The reality was far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. These men weren't charlatans or frauds, at least not in the way we might imagine. They were the inheritors of a medical tradition that stretched back through centuries, a careful accumulation of knowledge that had been passed down through Islamic scholars, ancient Greek texts, and Roman practices. They had libraries, they had theories, they had absolute confidence in methods that had been refined over generations. And yet, they were killing their patients with stunning regularity. The problem wasn't ignorance exactly. It was something far more insidious. It was the kind of systematic wrongness that comes from building an entire worldview on foundations that seem logical, seem consistent, seem obviously true, but happen to be catastrophically incorrect. Imagine being absolutely certain that the earth is flat, that the sun revolves around us, that illness is caused by bad air, and that the best way to treat almost any ailment is to drain the patient's blood until they're weak, pale, and teetering on the edge of death. Now imagine being so confident in these beliefs that you stake human lives on them, day after day, patient after patient, never quite connecting the dots between your treatment and the remarkably high mortality rate in your care. This was medieval medicine, a perfect storm of good intentions, inherited wisdom, and deadly misconceptions. Let's start with bloodletting, perhaps the most infamous of medieval medical practices, and one that perfectly captures the tragic absurdity of the era. The theory behind it was elegant in its simplicity. Medieval doctors believed that the human body contained four essential humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness occurred when these humours became imbalanced. Too much blood, you'd become feverish, agitated, prone to violence. The solution was obvious. Remove the excess blood and restore balance to the system. It made perfect sense. It was logical. It was based on centuries of medical tradition dating back to ancient Greece. And it was almost universally fatal when applied to seriously ill patients. Picture a medieval physician entering a sick room where a patient lies burning with fever. The doctor examines the patient, notes the flushed skin, the rapid pulse, the obvious signs of excess blood in the system. He nods knowingly, opens his leather satchel, and withdraws a small, sharp blade. The patient, already weakened by illness, is about to lose a significant portion of the very blood their body needs to fight off infection. The process itself was ritualistic, almost ceremonial. The doctor would make careful incisions in the patient's arm or leg, sometimes multiple cuts to ensure adequate drainage. Blood would flow into bowls, and the physician would watch carefully, monitoring the colour, the consistency, the volume. When enough had been drained, when the patient's pulse had weakened sufficiently, when their skin had gone from flushed to pale, the doctor would nod with satisfaction. The excess humour had been removed. Balance had been restored. The healing could begin. Of course, what was actually happening was that an already compromised immune system was being further weakened. A body struggling to fight off infection was being deprived of the very cells it needed to mount a defense. Patients who might have recovered with rest and proper nutrition were instead being systematically drained of their strength, their resistance, their ability to heal. But the doctors didn't see it that way. When patients died after bloodletting, it wasn't because the treatment had failed. It was because they hadn't received enough treatment, or they'd received it too late, or the imbalance had been too severe to correct. The theory was sound. The method was proven. If it didn't work, the fault lay with the patient, not the practice. And so the bloodletting continued, generation after generation, doctor after doctor, patient after patient. It was practiced in the grandest courts and the humblest cottages. Kings and peasants alike submitted to the blade, believing they were receiving the finest medical care available. Some patients, the lucky ones with minor ailments or robust constitutions, survived despite the treatment. Their recoveries were held up as proof of the method's effectiveness. The countless others who died were simply the unfortunate victims of illnesses too severe for even the best medical science to cure. But bloodletting was just the beginning. Medieval medicine had developed an entire arsenal of treatments that shared a common thread. They weakened patients at precisely the moment when strength was most needed. Take purging, for instance, another cornerstone of medieval medical practice. The theory, once again, was elegantly simple. Illness often manifested as corruption within the body, impurities that needed to be expelled. The solution was to induce violent vomiting and diarrhea, forcing the body to rid itself of whatever toxic substances were causing the problem. Doctors had developed an impressive array of purgatives, substances designed to trigger the most dramatic possible evacuation of the stomach and bowels. Antimony, a toxic metal that could cause severe poisoning. Calomel, a mercury compound that could damage organs even as it induced vomiting. Various plant-based concoctions that could strip the lining of the digestive system while forcing the body to expel its contents. The process was horrific. Patients would be given these substances and then left to endure hours of violent retching and evacuation. They'd become dehydrated, electrolyte depleted, utterly exhausted. But the doctors saw this as progress. The corruption was being expelled. The body was cleansing itself. The worse the patient felt during the process, the more effective the treatment appeared to be. What was actually happening, of course, was that already sick patients were being pushed into states of severe dehydration and chemical imbalance. Bodies trying to fight off infection were being forced to divert precious energy towards simply staying alive during the purging process. Digestive systems were being damaged, immune responses were being compromised, and recovery was being made infinitely more difficult. Yet again, when patients died, the fault lay not with the treatment, but with the severity of their condition. They'd been too far gone, too corrupted, too imbalanced for even the most aggressive intervention to save them. The doctors would shake their heads sadly, make notes about the case, and move on to the next patient, confident that they'd done everything possible within the bounds of medical knowledge. Perhaps most tragically, these treatments were often applied to the patients who needed them least and could tolerate them worst. Children, with their smaller bodies and limited reserves, were subjected to the same bloodletting and purging as adults. Pregnant women, already stressed by the demands of carrying new life, were drained and purged with the same enthusiasm as any other patient. The elderly, whose systems were already fragile, received treatments that would challenge the constitution of the healthiest young adult. The irony is breathtaking. Medieval medicine had developed a system so perfectly backward that it consistently did the opposite of what healing required. Where rest was needed, it provided exhaustion. Where nutrition was crucial, it induced vomiting. Where the body needed to conserve its strength, it forced the loss of vital fluids. Where immunity needed support, it systematically weakened resistance. And through it all, the doctors remained convinced they were practicing the highest form of medical art. They'd studied the ancient texts. They'd learned the proper techniques. They'd observed the human body and developed theories to explain what they saw. They were not ignorant peasants relying on folk remedies and superstition. They were educated professionals, the medieval equivalent of today's specialists, armed with centuries of accumulated knowledge and absolute confidence in their methods. This confidence was perhaps the most dangerous element of all. A humble healer might second-guess themselves, might try different approaches when patients consistently failed to improve. But these medieval physicians had no such doubts. They knew what caused illness. They knew how to treat it. When their methods failed, it was not because the methods were wrong, but because the illness was too advanced, the patient too weak, or the treatment too little too late. The human capacity for self-deception, it seems, is as limitless as our capacity for compassion. And in medieval Europe, that self-deception was dressed in scholarly robes, armed with sharp instruments, and given free rein to practice on anyone unfortunate enough to fall ill. But the story grows stranger still, because these doctors didn't work in isolation. They were part of a larger medical community, a network of professionals who shared knowledge, compared techniques, and refined their understanding of the human body. They wrote treatises, held discussions, and passed their wisdom on to the next generation of healers. The most successful practitioners, those with the highest reputations and the wealthiest patients, were often those who applied these deadly treatments with the greatest skill and consistency. The medical schools of medieval Europe were marvels of organization and dedication. In places like Salerno, Montpellier, and later Paris, young men gathered to absorb the wisdom of ages, to learn the sacred art of healing from masters who had themselves learned from masters before them. These institutions were not crude workshops where folk remedies were passed down through whispered rumors. They were centers of learning, complete with libraries, lecture halls, and rigorous curricula that could take years to complete. Students would spend months memorizing the works of Galen, the ancient Roman physician whose theories formed the backbone of medieval medical understanding. They'd study the writings of Avicenna, the Persian polymath whose medical encyclopedia was considered the ultimate authority on human anatomy and disease. They'd learn to read the signs of the body, to interpret symptoms, to understand the delicate balance of humours that kept a person healthy or cast them into illness. The education was thorough systematic, and utterly wrong. But here's what makes this tragedy so much deeper. These weren't just individual doctors making isolated mistakes. This was an entire system of knowledge, refined over centuries, taught in the finest institutions, and practiced by the most educated minds of the age. When a young physician graduated from medical school, he carried with him not just a few dangerous techniques, but an entire worldview that would guide every decision he made for the rest of his career. And that worldview was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how life itself worked. Consider the case of Guy de Chauliac, one of the most celebrated surgeons of the 14th century. His reputation stretched across Europe. Nobles and commoners alike sought his services. He wrote extensively about surgical techniques, and his works were studied by generations of medical students. By any measure of his time, he was a brilliant success, a master of his craft. He was also, by modern standards, a walking catastrophe. Guy de Chauliac believed, as did all his contemporaries, that pus was a healthy sign of healing. When a wound became infected, when it swelled with thick yellow discharge, this was not cause for alarm, but rather evidence that the body was responding properly to injury. He would deliberately introduce foreign substances into wounds to encourage this laudable pus, ensuring that what should have been clean healing became infected, painful, and often fatal. His surgical instruments were not sterilized because the concept of infection as something that could be prevented simply didn't exist. He would move from patient to patient, from surgery to surgery, carrying bacteria and disease on his hands and tools like some medieval angel of death, spreading contamination wherever he went. The very act of seeking his expert care often meant signing one's own death warrant. But Guy de Chauliac was not a monster. He was a dedicated healer who genuinely cared about his patients. He spent years perfecting his techniques, studying anatomy, developing new surgical procedures. When patients died under his care, he mourned their loss and redoubled his efforts to become a better physician. He wrote about his failures as well as his successes, always seeking to improve his understanding of the human body. The tragedy is that his dedication, his intelligence, his genuine desire to heal were all channeled through a system of knowledge that made him more dangerous, not less. The more skilled he became at medieval medicine, the more efficiently he killed his patients. The more he learned about the theories of his time, the more confidently he applied treatments that were systematically harmful. This pattern repeated itself across Europe, across centuries, across every level of medical practice. The village barber surgeon who pulled teeth and set bones, the court physician who tended to kings and queens, the monastery infirmarian who cared for sick monks, they all shared the same fundamental misconceptions about health and disease. They all applied variations of the same deadly treatments. They all believed they were practicing the highest form of medical art. The human cost was staggering, not just in terms of individual deaths, though those were numerous enough, but in terms of entire populations living in constant fear of falling ill. In a world where seeking medical attention often meant hastening one's death, people developed a relationship with their bodies, with pain, with illness that we can barely comprehend today. Imagine living in a time when a simple fever might kill you. Not because effective treatment didn't exist, but because the treatment itself was likely to be fatal. Imagine watching a loved one grow sicker and sicker under a doctor's care, not understanding why the bleeding and purging seemed to make everything worse. Imagine being a parent, faced with a sick child, having to choose between doing nothing and seeking help from professionals who, unknown to anyone, were more likely to harm than heal. This was the daily reality for millions of people across medieval Europe. They lived in a world where the very people they trusted most, the learned men who had dedicated their lives to understanding the human body, were systematically applying treatments that made recovery less likely, not more. But the story becomes even more complex when we consider how these doctors interpreted their results. Because, of course, some patients did survive. The human body is remarkably resilient. and many illnesses resolved themselves given time and rest. When a patient recovered after bloodletting and purging, this was taken as clear evidence that the treatment had worked. The fact that the patient might have recovered faster and more completely without any intervention at all was a possibility that simply didn't occur to medieval physicians. This created a feedback loop that reinforced their dangerous practices. Every recovery proved the effectiveness of their methods. Every death was explained away as the result of the disease being too advanced, the patient being too weak, or the treatment being applied too late. The treatments themselves were never questioned because the theoretical framework that supported them was so internally consistent, so well established, so thoroughly accepted by the medical community. It's worth pausing to consider how this could happen. How could an entire civilization, an entire profession, be so systematically wrong about something so fundamental as healing? The answer lies partly in the nature of knowledge itself, in how we build our understanding of the world around us. Medieval medicine wasn't born from nothing. It was built on the accumulated wisdom of centuries, on the careful observations of countless physicians, on theories that seemed to explain the patterns they observed. When a patient with too much blood became feverish and agitated, bloodletting often did calm them down, at least temporarily. When someone with digestive problems was purged, they often did feel better afterward, at least for a while. The immediate effects of these treatments often seemed to confirm their effectiveness, even when the long-term consequences were deadly. Moreover, medieval physicians were working without the tools we take for granted today. They couldn't see bacteria or viruses. They couldn't measure blood pressure or monitor heart rate with precision. They couldn't perform blood tests or X-rays or any of the diagnostic techniques that allow modern medicine to understand what's actually happening inside the human body. They had to rely on external observations, on theories that seemed to make sense of what they could see and touch and hear. Given these limitations, the humoral theory of medicine actually represented a remarkable intellectual achievement. It was an attempt to create a systematic, rational approach to understanding health and disease. It provided a framework for diagnosis and treatment that could be taught, learned, and applied consistently. It was, in its way, genuinely scientific, based on observation and logical reasoning. It was also completely wrong. But perhaps most importantly, it was accepted without question by virtually everyone in medieval society. Patients expected to be bled when they were ill. They would have been suspicious of a doctor who didn't recommend purging for certain conditions. The treatments were so deeply embedded in the culture, so thoroughly accepted as the proper response to illness, that questioning them would have seemed not just foolish, but dangerous. This social aspect of medieval medicine cannot be understated. These doctors weren't operating in isolation, making individual decisions about how to treat their patients. They were part of a vast social system that expected certain behaviors, certain treatments, certain outcomes. A physician who refused to bleed a feverish patient would have been seen as incompetent or negligent. A doctor who questioned the fundamental principles of humoral medicine would have been dismissed as a dangerous radical. So the deadly cycle continued, reinforced by education, by tradition, by social expectation, and by the apparent success of treatments that were actually hastening death. Generation after generation of doctors learned the same techniques, applied the same theories, and achieved the same tragic results. The medical profession had become a self-perpetuating system of well-intentioned harm. And the most haunting aspect of this entire story is how confident these physicians remained, even in the face of consistently poor outcomes. They had explanations for everything. When bloodletting didn't work, it was because not enough blood had been removed. When purging failed to cure, it was because the corruption ran too deep. When patients died despite treatment, it was because the illness had progressed too far before medical intervention could be effective. The possibility that their treatments were actively harmful, that their patients might fare better with no medical intervention at all, was simply unthinkable. It would have required them to question not just their methods, but their entire understanding of the world, their role in society, their very identity as healers. Human beings, it seems, will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid confronting the possibility that their deepest beliefs might be fundamentally flawed, and in medieval Europe, this very human tendency was dressed in scholarly robes, armed with sharp blades, and given the power to determine who lived and who died. The story of medieval medicine is, in many ways, a story about the dangers of certainty, about what happens when we become so convinced of our own understanding that we stop questioning, stop learning, stop considering the possibility that we might be wrong. It's a reminder that intelligence and education and good intentions are not always enough to prevent us from causing tremendous harm. These were not isolated incidents happening in the shadows of medieval society. This was mainstream medicine, practiced in the great cities, in royal courts, in monasteries that served as centers of learning and healing. The most prestigious physicians of the age were often those who applied these deadly treatments with the greatest skill and confidence. Take the case of Bernard de Gordon, a professor at the University of Montpellier in the early 14th century. His medical treatise, the Lilium Medicinae, was considered one of the finest works of its time, studied by physicians across Europe for generations. In it, he describes with meticulous detail how to properly bleed a patient, explaining that the amount of blood to be drawn should be determined by the patient's age, constitution, and the phase of the moon. He advocates for bleeding to the point of fainting, believing this indicates that the proper balance has been achieved. Modern readers might assume such practices were the domain of quacks and charlatans, but Bernard de Gordon was the medieval equivalent of a department head at Johns Hopkins. He was respected, learned, and utterly convinced that he was saving lives with every carefully calculated bloodletting. His students would graduate and spread across Europe, carrying his teachings to patients who trusted them with their lives. The sophistication of medieval medical theory only made matters worse. These weren't simple folk remedies passed down through oral tradition. Medieval physicians had developed elaborate systems for diagnosis and treatment that required years of study to master. They could look at a patient's complexion, examine their urine, check their pulse, and determine with absolute confidence which of the four humours was out of balance and by how much. The diagnostic process itself was genuinely impressive in its complexity. Physicians would examine urine not just for colour, but for clarity, sediment, and even taste. They believed that different layers in a urine sample could reveal the condition of different organs. A skilled physician could supposedly diagnose dozens of different conditions simply by studying a patient's morning water, interpreting subtle variations that revealed the inner workings of the human body. Of course, none of it actually worked. The elaborate diagnostic criteria were based on completely false assumptions about human physiology, but the system was so detailed, so internally consistent, that it created an illusion of scientific precision. Patients were impressed by doctors who could make confident diagnoses based on seemingly minor symptoms. The more complex the diagnostic process, the more credible it appeared. This false precision extended to treatment as well. Medieval physicians didn't just bleed patients randomly. They had specific protocols for different conditions, different seasons, different types of patients. They calculated exactly how much blood should be drawn based on the patient's age, sex, and constitution. They determined the optimal timing based on astrological considerations and the patient's symptoms. They even had preferences for which veins to open, depending on what part of the body was affected. The treatments were applied with the same meticulous care that a modern surgeon might use when performing a delicate operation. Every step was deliberate, every decision based on established medical theory. The physicians took detailed notes, tracked their patients' progress, and adjusted their treatments based on how the patient responded. What they failed to recognize was that their careful observations were being filtered through a completely incorrect understanding of human biology. They were like astronomers, trying to chart the movement of planets, while believing the Earth was the center of the universe. Their observations were accurate, their mathematical calculations were precise, but their fundamental assumptions were so wrong that every conclusion they drew led them further from the truth. The tragedy deepened when these physicians encountered conditions that modern medicine treats routinely. A patient with pneumonia would be bled until they were weak and pale, their body's ability to fight infection systematically undermined. Someone with a heart condition would be purged until they were dehydrated and their electrolytes dangerously imbalanced. A woman suffering from complications in childbirth would be subjected to treatments that made recovery infinitely more difficult. Medieval physicians had even developed specialized treatments for different types of patients that were particularly devastating in their effects. Children, they believed, had naturally hot and moist constitutions that required aggressive cooling through bloodletting. Pregnant women were thought to accumulate excess blood that needed to be regularly drained to prevent complications. The elderly were considered to have an excess of cold, dry humors that required warming treatments that often included toxic substances. In each case, the treatments were precisely backward from what would actually help. Children's developing immune systems were weakened just when they needed strength most. Pregnant women were deprived of the blood volume they needed to support both themselves and their unborn children. The elderly were given treatments that their already fragile systems could barely survive. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the cases involving infectious diseases. Medieval Europe was regularly swept by epidemics that killed thousands, and physicians responded with their standard arsenal of bloodletting, purging, and toxic medicines. When the Black Death ravaged Europe in the 14th century, doctors worked tirelessly to treat victims using every technique at their disposal. They bled plague victims who were already hemorrhaging internally. They purged patients who were already suffering from severe dehydration. They administered mercury compounds to people whose organs were already failing. The physicians themselves often died in these epidemics, not because they lacked courage, but because they stayed with their patients, applying treatments that made both doctor and patient more vulnerable to disease. They were heroes in the truest sense, willing to risk their lives to help others. They were also, unknowingly, making the epidemics worse with every patient they treated. Some medieval physicians did begin to notice patterns that should have given them pause. They observed that patients who received no treatment sometimes recovered, while those who received intensive medical care often died. But rather than questioning their methods, they developed explanations that preserved their belief in humoral medicine. Patients who recovered without treatment, they reasoned, must have had only minor imbalances that corrected themselves naturally. Those who died despite treatment were simply too far gone to be saved. The few physicians who did dare to question established practices faced professional ostracism and accusations of incompetence. Medical guilds enforced strict adherence to traditional methods. Universities refused to hire professors who deviated from accepted teachings. Patients themselves often demanded treatments they'd heard were effective, threatening to seek care elsewhere if their physician refused to bleed them or prescribe the purges they expected. This social pressure created a system where innovation was not just discouraged, but actively dangerous to a physician's career. A doctor who achieved better outcomes by avoiding traditional treatments would struggle to explain their success without challenging the fundamental theories that underpinned all of medieval medicine. It was easier, safer, and more socially acceptable to continue applying deadly treatments while developing increasingly elaborate explanations for why they sometimes failed. The economic incentives also worked against reform. Bloodletting and purging were dramatic, visible treatments that made patients feel that something important was being done for their condition. A physician who simply recommended rest and proper nutrition seemed to be doing nothing, even when this approach was far more effective. Patients were more willing to pay substantial fees for elaborate medical interventions than for advice to stay in bed and eat well. Medieval physicians had also developed a vast pharmacopoeia of substances that were used to support their bloodletting and purging regimens. Apothecaries sold compounds made from mercury, antimony, lead, and other toxic metals that were believed to have powerful healing properties. The more exotic and expensive the ingredient, the more effective it was presumed to be. Physicians competed to prescribe the most sophisticated combinations of these substances, creating complex formulations that were often more poisonous than any disease they were meant to treat. The preparation of these medicines was itself a specialized art that required extensive knowledge of alchemy, astrology, and herbal lore. Physicians would carefully time the collection and preparation of ingredients according to astrological calculations, believing that the power of celestial bodies could be captured and concentrated in their remedies. They would distill essences, create tinctures, and compound pills using techniques that had been refined over centuries. The irony is that some of these preparations did contain substances that could have been genuinely helpful if used properly. Willow bark, which contains compounds similar to aspirin, was sometimes included in pain-relieving mixtures. Digitalis, derived from foxglove, could help with certain heart conditions when used in careful doses. But these potentially beneficial substances were typically combined with toxic metals and administered in ways that negated any positive effects while maximizing harm. Medieval physicians also developed elaborate theories about how different medicines worked in the body. They believed that each substance had specific qualities, hot or cold, wet or dry, that could be used to counteract imbalances in the patient's humors. A patient who was too hot and wet might be given medicines that were cold and dry. Someone who was too cold and dry would receive hot and wet remedies. This approach led to treatments that were not just ineffective, but specifically designed to stress the patient's system in ways that made recovery more difficult. A feverish patient, already struggling with infection, would be given cooling medicines that often contained toxic substances. Someone suffering from weakness and fatigue would receive heating remedies that could damage their organs, even as they made them feel temporarily more energetic. The confidence with which these treatments were prescribed was perhaps their most dangerous aspect. Medieval physicians had no doubt that they were applying the most advanced medical knowledge available. They had studied for years, mastered complex theoretical systems, and learned to prepare sophisticated remedies. When they prescribed a course of bloodletting followed by purging and treatment with mercury compounds, they did so with the same certainty that a modern doctor might have when prescribing antibiotics for a bacterial infection. This certainty was communicated to patients and their families, who placed absolute trust in their physician's expertise. When a doctor explained that excess blood was causing a patient's fever and that bleeding would restore the proper balance, the family accepted this explanation without question. When purging was prescribed to remove corrupt humors, patients submitted to hours of violent illness because they believed it was necessary for their recovery. The psychological impact of this trust cannot be overstated. Patients who might have recovered with rest and supportive care instead endured treatments that weakened them physically while convincing them that they were receiving the best possible medical attention. The placebo effect, which can sometimes help patients heal, was turned against them as they placed their faith in treatments that were actively harmful. Medieval hospitals, which were often run by religious orders dedicated to caring for the sick, became inadvertent centers for spreading these deadly practices. Monks and nuns who staffed these institutions learned medical techniques from visiting physicians and applied them with the same dedication they brought to their spiritual duties. The combination of religious authority and medical expertise made these treatments seem not just scientifically sound, but morally necessary. Patients who entered medieval hospitals expecting sanctuary and healing instead found themselves subjected to systematic bloodletting, purging, and treatment with toxic substances. The very places that should have offered refuge from illness became locations where the sick were made sicker through the application of learned medical theory. The records that survive from these institutions paint a picture of well-meaning caregivers who documented their treatments with meticulous care while achieving outcomes that would be considered malpractice by any modern standard. They noted which patients were bled, how much blood was drawn, what purges were administered, and what medicines were prescribed. They tracked recovery rates and developed theories about why some treatments seemed more effective than others. What they failed to recognize was that their most successful cases were often those where they intervened least, where patients recovered despite their treatments rather than because of them. The human body's remarkable ability to heal itself was constantly working against the medical interventions of the time, and when it succeeded, the credit went to the physicians rather than to the patient's own resilience. This pattern of misattributed success created a feedback loop that reinforced dangerous practices across the entire medical profession. Every recovery was seen as validation of humoral theory and traditional treatments. Every death was explained as the inevitable result of disease progression rather than medical intervention. The possibility that less treatment might lead to better outcomes was literally unthinkable within the prevailing medical worldview. And so the cycle continued, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. Learned physicians applied their deadly arts with growing confidence, supported by increasingly elaborate theories and increasingly sophisticated techniques. The more they learned within their flawed system, the more dangerous they became. The more skilled they grew at medieval medicine, the more efficiently they hastened their patients toward death. The medieval physician's day began before dawn, not with prayers for divine guidance, though many were deeply religious men, but with consultations of astrological charts that would determine the timing of every medical intervention. These weren't superstitious folk checking horoscopes in the morning paper. These were learned scholars who believed with absolute conviction that the movement of celestial bodies directly influenced the flow of humours within the human body. Mars ascending might indicate that bloodletting should be delayed. A waning moon could suggest that purging would be less effective. Venus in conjunction with Mercury might mean that certain medicines would be particularly potent. This wasn't casual stargazing. Medieval physicians had developed elaborate mathematical systems for calculating the optimal timing of medical procedures based on planetary positions. They owned expensive astrolabes and complex charts that allowed them to determine down to the hour when their treatments would be most effective. A patient arriving with a fever might be told to return in 3 days when the stars would be properly aligned for bloodletting. Someone seeking treatment for digestive problems might have their purging scheduled to coincide with specific lunar phases. The tragic irony is that this astrological timing often accidentally saved lives. When a physician delayed a harmful treatment because the stars weren't right, the patient sometimes recovered naturally during the waiting period. But rather than recognizing that the delay itself might be beneficial, the doctor would credit the improved timing of his intervention. The stars had guided him to apply his treatment at precisely the right moment, proving once again the wisdom of celestial medicine. Medieval medical education reinforced these beliefs through years of intensive study that combined the worst elements of rigid dogma and elaborate complexity. Students didn't just memorize lists of symptoms and treatments. They learned to navigate vast theoretical systems that connected human anatomy to cosmic forces, individual temperament to seasonal changes, and disease progression to mathematical calculations that would challenge modern statisticians. Consider the education of a typical medical student at the University of Paris in the 13th century. His day would begin with lectures on the works of Galen, delivered in Latin by professors who had themselves spent decades mastering these ancient texts. The student would learn that the liver produced blood, that the heart generated vital spirit, and that the brain created animal spirit. He would study how these 3 organs worked together to maintain the delicate balance of humours that kept a person healthy. But the education went far beyond basic anatomy. Students learned to interpret dozens of different types of pulse, each supposedly revealing different information about the patient's condition. They memorized the properties of hundreds of medicinal substances, from common herbs to exotic compounds imported from distant lands. They studied the relationship between personality types and susceptibility to different diseases, learning to diagnose not just illness, but character flaws that might predispose someone to future health problems. Most importantly, they learned to think like medieval physicians, to see the human body not as a biological machine that could malfunction in straightforward ways, but as a complex system of interacting forces that required constant adjustment and intervention. A fever wasn't just a symptom to be treated. It was evidence of a fundamental imbalance that could affect every aspect of the patient's physical and mental well-being. This holistic approach to medicine might sound appealing to modern ears, and in some ways, it was more sophisticated than the reductionist thinking that would dominate later centuries. Medieval physicians understood that mental and physical health were connected, that diet and lifestyle affected disease, and that treatment needed to address the whole person rather than just isolated symptoms. The problem was that their understanding of how all these connections worked was completely wrong, and their interventions consistently made everything worse. A patient with what we would now recognize as depression might be diagnosed with an excess of black bile, leading to treatments designed to heat and dry their constitution. They would be bled to remove the offending humor, purged to eliminate corrupt substances, and given medicines containing toxic metals that were believed to have warming properties. The patient, already struggling with mental illness, would find themselves physically weakened, chemically poisoned, and emotionally devastated by treatments that were supposed to restore their natural cheerfulness. Someone suffering from what we might call anxiety would be diagnosed with too much blood, making them hot and agitated. The solution was aggressive bloodletting to calm their system, often combined with sedating medicines that contained opium or other powerful substances. The patient would emerge from treatment weak, confused, and often dependent on the very medicines that were supposed to cure them. Medieval physicians had even developed specialized approaches for different social classes, believing that noble blood required different treatment than peasant blood. Aristocratic patients were thought to have more refined constitutions that demanded gentler, more expensive interventions. They might be bled with silver instruments rather than iron ones, given medicines prepared from rare ingredients, and treated with elaborate ceremonies that reflected their social status. Peasants, on the other hand, were considered to have coarser constitutions that could tolerate, and indeed required, more aggressive treatments. They would be bled more heavily, purged more violently, and given cheaper medicines that often contained higher concentrations of toxic substances. The irony is that this class-based medicine accidentally gave poor patients more dangerous treatments while providing the wealthy with interventions that were merely ineffective rather than actively harmful. The economic structure of medieval medicine also created perverse incentives that made reform nearly impossible. Physicians were paid not for their success in healing patients, but for the complexity and drama of their interventions. A doctor who could perform elaborate bloodletting procedures, prepare exotic medicines, and provide detailed astrological consultations could command much higher fees than one who simply advised rest and good nutrition. This payment system meant that the most financially successful physicians were often those who provided the most harmful treatments. They developed reputations for being able to handle the most difficult cases, not because they achieved better outcomes, but because they applied their deadly arts with greater skill and confidence. Patients and their families, lacking any way to measure actual effectiveness, judged their doctors by the impressiveness of the treatments they provided. The rise of medical guilds in the later medieval period only made this situation worse. These professional organizations, similar to the craft guilds that regulated other trades, established strict standards for medical practice that were based entirely on traditional methods. A physician who wanted to practice legally had to demonstrate mastery of bloodletting, purging, and the preparation of standard medicines. Innovation wasn't just discouraged, it was literally illegal. Guild members were required to follow established protocols for treating different conditions. A physician who refused to bleed a feverish patient could be expelled from the guild and prohibited from practicing medicine. Someone who questioned the effectiveness of purging could be accused of incompetence or heresy. The guilds created a system where the most dangerous practitioners were held up as models of professional excellence, while anyone who achieved better outcomes through different methods was marginalized or expelled. The legal framework surrounding medieval medicine reinforced these deadly practices in other ways as well. When patients died under a physician's care, the doctor was generally protected from prosecution, as long as he had followed established medical procedures. A physician who bled a patient to death, according to guild guidelines, was considered to have provided proper care, while one who achieved better outcomes through unorthodox methods might face criminal charges if anything went wrong. This legal protection created a situation where physicians had every incentive to follow traditional practices, no matter how ineffective they proved to be. It was safer to kill patients using accepted methods than to save them using innovative approaches. The law, the guilds, the universities, and the economic system all worked together to ensure that medieval medicine remained locked in its deadly patterns. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this entire system was how it shaped the relationship between physicians and their patients. Medieval doctors weren't distant, uncaring professionals who applied their treatments mechanically. Many were deeply compassionate men who formed genuine emotional bonds with the people they treated. They sat by bedsides during long illnesses, comforted grieving families, and often risked their own health to care for patients during epidemics. This emotional investment made it even harder for them to recognize the harm they were causing. When a beloved patient died after intensive treatment, the physician didn't just lose a case, he lost someone he cared about. The emotional pain of these losses drove many doctors to study harder, to refine their techniques, and to apply their treatments with even greater dedication. The more they cared, the more dangerous they became. Patients, for their part, often developed deep trust and affection for physicians who showed them such personal attention. A doctor who spent hours at a bedside, who explained his treatments in detail, who showed genuine concern for his patient's well-being, seemed obviously superior to one who provided less intensive care. The fact that the less attentive physician might achieve better outcomes was impossible to perceive when the criteria for judging medical care had nothing to do with actual survival rates. This emotional dimension of medieval medicine created powerful psychological barriers to recognizing its failures. Both doctors and patients invested so much meaning in the healing relationship that questioning the effectiveness of treatments felt like questioning the caring itself. A physician who suggested that his bloodletting might be harmful wasn't just challenging medical theory, he was undermining the trust and affection that formed the foundation of his practice. The religious context of medieval life added another layer of complexity to this situation. Many physicians saw their work as a form of spiritual calling, a way of participating in God's plan for human healing. They believed that their ability to diagnose and treat illness was a divine gift that carried moral responsibilities as well as practical obligations. To question their methods wasn't just scientific skepticism, it was a form of spiritual doubt that could threaten their entire sense of purpose and identity. Patients often shared this religious understanding of medicine. They saw their physician as an instrument of divine will, someone who had been given special knowledge and abilities to help them in their time of need. Submitting to painful treatments became a form of religious discipline, a way of demonstrating faith in God's plan for their recovery. The more they suffered during treatment, the more spiritually meaningful the experience became. This religious framework made it almost impossible to evaluate medical treatments based on their practical effectiveness. When patients died, it was God's will. When they recovered, it was through divine intervention, facilitated by the physician's skill. The treatments themselves existed in a realm beyond ordinary cause and effect, protected by faith from rational analysis. Medieval physicians also developed elaborate theories about the moral dimensions of illness that made their patients complicit in their own suffering. Disease was often seen as a consequence of sin, excess, or moral failing. A patient with a fever might be told that their condition resulted from anger or pride that had heated their blood beyond healthy levels. Someone with digestive problems might be diagnosed with gluttony that had corrupted their stomach. These moral diagnoses made the painful treatments seem not just medically necessary, but spiritually appropriate. Bloodletting became a form of penance that would purify the patient's soul, as well as their body. Purging was a way of expelling not just corrupt humours, but the spiritual contamination that had caused them. The more a patient suffered during treatment, the more thoroughly their sins were being cleansed. This moralization of medicine created a feedback loop where patients were expected to endure increasingly painful treatments as proof of their commitment to recovery and spiritual purification. A patient who complained about the pain of bloodletting might be told that their resistance revealed the depth of their spiritual corruption. Someone who questioned the need for repeated purging could be accused of lacking the moral strength necessary for true healing. The combination of religious authority, professional expertise, and moral judgment made medieval physicians almost unassailable in their authority over patients. They weren't just medical practitioners, they were spiritual guides who could interpret the hidden meanings of illness and prescribe treatments that addressed both physical and moral corruption. Questioning their methods became tantamount to rejecting not just medical science, but religious truth itself. And so, the deadly cycle continued, reinforced by every institution and belief system in medieval society. The more elaborate the theoretical framework became, the more confident physicians grew in their methods. The more they cared about their patients, the more intensively they applied treatments that hastened death. The more successful they appeared within their own system of measurement, the more dangerous they became to anyone unlucky enough to fall under their care. By the 14th century, European medicine had reached a kind of deadly perfection. Physicians could diagnose dozens of different conditions based on subtle variations in pulse, urine, and complexion. They could prepare hundreds of different medicines from exotic ingredients gathered across the known world. They could time their treatments to coincide with astrological events and adjust their methods based on the patient's social class, age, and moral condition. They had created a medical system of breathtaking complexity and sophistication that was perfectly designed to kill the people it was meant to heal. And they had done it all with the best of intentions, driven by genuine compassion and an absolute certainty that they were practicing the highest form of healing art known to humanity. The great medical schools of Europe had become factories for producing learned killers. The most prestigious hospitals had become temples to systematic harm. The most caring and dedicated physicians had become the most efficient agents of death, and none of them knew it because they had built their entire world around ideas that were not just wrong, but catastrophically, systematically, lethally wrong. In the quiet hours before dawn, as medieval physicians prepared for another day of healing, they had no idea that they were about to spend their time hastening the deaths of people who trusted them completely. They said their prayers, consulted their charts, and prepared their instruments with the same sense of purpose and dedication that had driven their teachers and their teachers' teachers before them. The sun would rise on another day of learned medicine practiced with skill, compassion, and absolute confidence. And as it set, more patients would have died from their cures than from their diseases, victims of humanity's most well-intentioned and systematic failure to understand the difference between helping and harming. The monasteries of medieval Europe were supposed to be sanctuaries of healing, places where the sick could find refuge and the knowledge of ancient texts could be preserved for future generations. Instead, they became some of the most efficient killing grounds in Christendom, staffed by devoted monks and nuns who believed they were doing God's work while systematically destroying the lives entrusted to their care. Picture Brother Thomas, a gentle Benedictine monk who spent his days tending to the sick in the infirmary of his monastery. He rose before dawn for prayers, spent hours copying medical texts by candlelight, and approached each patient with the kind of selfless compassion that we might expect from a saint. He was learned, having studied the works of Galen and Avicenna. He was experienced, having treated hundreds of patients over his decades of service. He was beloved by his community, respected by visiting physicians, and trusted completely by the families who brought their sick to his care. He was also, by any objective measure, a mass murderer. But Brother Thomas would have been horrified by such an accusation. In his mind, he was following in the footsteps of Christ himself, healing the sick and comforting the afflicted. When he opened a vein to release corrupt blood, he was performing a sacred act of purification. When he administered powerful purgatives that left patients writhing in agony, he was helping them expel the spiritual as well as physical poisons that cause their suffering. When his treatments failed and patients died, he mourned their loss and prayed for their souls, never once suspecting that his own hands had hastened their journey to the grave. The monastic medical system had developed its own particularly deadly characteristics that made it even more dangerous than secular medicine. Monks and nuns weren't motivated by profit or professional advancement. They genuinely believed they were serving God by caring for the sick, which meant they approached their deadly work with a level of dedication and intensity that secular physicians rarely matched. They would spend days at a patient's bedside, applying treatment after treatment with the persistence of true believers. This religious motivation also meant that monastic healers were more likely to see suffering as spiritually beneficial. A patient who endured bloodletting without complaint was demonstrating Christian virtue. Someone who submitted to violent purging was participating in a form of spiritual discipline that would benefit their soul as well as their body. The more a patient suffered during treatment, the more convinced the monastic healers became that they were providing genuine spiritual medicine. The monasteries also developed their own herbal traditions that added new layers of toxicity to the already dangerous arsenal of medieval medicine. Monks cultivated extensive gardens filled with medicinal plants, many of which were genuinely poisonous when used in the concentrations they believed were necessary for healing. They prepared elaborate compounds that combined traditional bloodletting and purging with plant-based medicines that could cause organ damage, neurological problems, and death. These monastic physicians were particularly fond of mercury-based preparations, which they believed had special purifying properties that aligned with their spiritual mission. They would administer mercury compounds to patients suffering from a wide range of conditions, from skin problems to mental illness, creating a slow poisoning that often proved fatal weeks or months after the initial treatment. The delayed nature of mercury poisoning made it nearly impossible for them to connect their medicines with the deaths that followed, especially since patients often left the monastery believing they had been cured, only to die at home as the toxic metals destroyed their organs. The educational system within monasteries created another layer of danger. Young monks learned medicine not from universities with their theoretical frameworks, but from older monks who had learned from their predecessors in an unbroken chain of deadly tradition. This apprenticeship system meant that harmful practices were passed down with even less opportunity for questioning or modification than existed in secular medical schools. A young monk learning to treat fever would watch his teacher bleed patient after patient until they were weak and pale, then would be praised for successfully replicating the same technique. He might notice that some patients seemed to get worse after treatment, but his teacher would explain this as evidence that the corruption ran deeper than initially apparent, requiring even more aggressive intervention. The possibility that the treatment itself was causing the deterioration was simply not part of the conceptual framework within which monastic medicine operated. The isolation of many monasteries also meant that their medical practices evolved in directions that were even more removed from reality than those of urban physicians. A monastery that developed a reputation for treating certain conditions might refine its techniques over generations without any external check on their effectiveness. They would attract patients from great distances, all seeking the special healing methods that had supposedly achieved miraculous results. These miracle cures were often the result of statistical chance combined with selective memory. In a monastery that treated hundreds of patients over the years, some would inevitably recover despite receiving harmful treatment. These recoveries would be remembered, celebrated, and attributed to the superior spiritual methods of the monastic healers. The far greater number of patients who died or were permanently harmed would be forgotten or explained away as victims of particularly severe spiritual corruption. The religious framework surrounding monastic medicine also created unique psychological pressures that made patients more likely to submit to harmful treatments. A person seeking healing at a monastery wasn't just a medical patient. They were a supplicant asking for divine intervention through the monk's sacred knowledge. Questioning the treatment became a form of spiritual rebellion that could jeopardize not just their physical healing, but their eternal salvation. Patients would often fast before receiving treatment, believing that this spiritual preparation would make the medicine more effective. This pre-treatment starvation meant that they entered the monastery already weakened and more vulnerable to the harmful effects of bloodletting and purging. The combination of religious fasting, spiritual anxiety, and aggressive medical intervention created conditions that were almost perfectly designed to kill even relatively healthy patients. The monastic emphasis on humility and acceptance of suffering also meant that patients were less likely to report pain or adverse effects from their treatments. A good Christian was expected to bear their afflictions with patience and gratitude. Complaining about the agony of repeated bloodletting or the violent effects of purgative medicines was seen as evidence of spiritual weakness that might interfere with the healing process. This created a feedback loop where the most harmful treatments appeared to be the most spiritually appropriate. Medicines that caused severe pain were obviously powerful and therefore effective. Procedures that left patients weak and debilitated were clearly working to expel the corruption from their systems. The worse a patient felt during treatment, the more convinced everyone became that the spiritual medicine was addressing deep-seated problems. Medieval monasteries also developed specialized treatments for conditions they considered to be primarily spiritual in nature. Mental illness, for instance, was often seen as demonic possession or divine punishment that required particularly aggressive intervention. Patients suffering from what we might recognize as depression, anxiety, or schizophrenia would be subjected to treatments designed not just to rebalance their humors, but to drive out evil spirits. These treatments often involved combinations of bloodletting, purging, and the administration of medicines containing toxic metals like mercury and lead, which could cause neurological damage that made the original mental illness worse. Patients who entered monasteries with relatively mild psychological problems could emerge as permanent invalids, their brains damaged by the very treatments that were supposed to heal their souls. The monastic approach to treating women's health problems was particularly devastating. Female patients were often seen as inherently more corrupt than male ones, their bodies viewed as naturally prone to dangerous imbalances that required constant medical intervention. Pregnancy, menstruation, and childbirth were all treated as pathological conditions that demanded aggressive bloodletting and purging to prevent spiritual and physical contamination. Pregnant women seeking help from monastic healers would be bled regularly throughout their pregnancy to prevent the accumulation of corrupt blood that might harm their unborn children. This bloodletting often caused anemia and weakness that made childbirth more dangerous. But the monks interpreted complications during delivery as evidence that their patient had not received enough treatment, rather than too much. Women suffering from what we might recognize as postpartum depression would be diagnosed with an excess of melancholic humors that required intensive purging and treatment with medicines containing toxic substances. The combination of physical weakness from childbirth, chemical poisoning from the medicines, and the psychological trauma of the treatment itself often left these women permanently damaged, unable to care for themselves or their children. The monasteries also developed their own approaches to surgical procedures that combined the dangers of medieval surgery with additional risks created by their spiritual interpretation of healing. Monastic surgeons believed that pain during operations was spiritually beneficial, both for the patient and, as a test of the surgeon's dedication to God's work. This meant they were less likely to use what pain-relieving substances were available, preferring to perform operations on fully conscious patients who were expected to endure their suffering as a form of religious discipline. The surgical instruments used in monasteries were often blessed before operations, but they were not cleaned or sterilized according to any systematic method. The monks believed that the spiritual purity of their intentions would protect patients from infection, making physical cleanliness seem less important than moral cleanliness. This spiritual approach to surgery created conditions where post-operative infections were virtually guaranteed. Though the monks interpreted these infections as evidence that the patient needed additional spiritual purification, monastic record-keeping practices also contributed to the perpetuation of deadly treatments. Unlike secular physicians who might keep detailed case notes for professional reasons, monks often recorded their medical activities as part of their spiritual journals, focusing more on the religious significance of their healing work than on practical outcomes. A patient who died after intensive treatment might be described as having achieved spiritual purification through suffering, while their actual cause of death was attributed to divine will rather than medical intervention. These records, when they survived, created a distorted picture of monastic medical practice that emphasized spiritual benefits while obscuring practical failures. Future generations of monastic healers would read these accounts and conclude that their predecessors had achieved remarkable success in combining physical and spiritual healing, encouraging them to apply the same deadly methods with even greater confidence. The economic structure of monastic medicine also created unique incentives for harmful treatment. Unlike secular physicians who charge fees for their services, monasteries often treated patients in exchange for donations, land grants, or promises of future support. This meant that wealthy patients who could make substantial contributions were more likely to receive intensive treatment, while poor patients might receive less attention. Ironically, this economic bias accidentally saved the lives of many poor patients who received minimal medical intervention, while wealthy donors who received the full attention of the monastic healers were more likely to die from their treatment. The monasteries interpreted this pattern as evidence that God favored the humble poor over the corrupt rich, never recognizing that their most intensive treatments were actually their most deadly ones. The seasonal rhythms of monastic life also influenced medical practice in ways that made treatments more dangerous. Certain times of the year were considered more appropriate for bloodletting and purging, based on astrological calculations combined with religious calendar events. This meant that patients arriving during favorable periods might receive more aggressive treatment, while those seeking help during less auspicious times might be told to wait or receive gentler interventions. The irony is that this timing system often accidentally protected patients during certain seasons while making treatment more deadly during others. A patient arriving during Lent, when the monks were focused on fasting and spiritual discipline, might receive less intensive medical intervention and have a better chance of recovery. Someone seeking help during periods dedicated to healing work might receive the full attention of the monastic medical system and be more likely to die as a result. The training of monastic healers also created unique problems that made them even more dangerous than their secular counterparts. Unlike university-trained physicians who at least had exposure to different theoretical frameworks, monastic healers learned within completely closed systems, where questioning established practices was seen as spiritual rebellion rather than intellectual curiosity. A young monk who noticed that patients seemed to fare worse after bloodletting would not dare to suggest that the treatment might be harmful. Instead, he would be taught to see his doubts as temptations sent by the devil to undermine his faith in God's healing methods. The more obvious the failure of their treatments became, the more convinced the monks became that they were facing spiritual warfare that required even more intensive intervention. This created monastic medical communities that were completely immune to learning from experience. No matter how many patients died, no matter how clear the pattern of failure became, The monks interpreted their results as spiritual challenges rather than practical problems. They would respond to medical disasters by increasing their prayers, intensifying their treatments, and dedicating themselves more completely to practices that were systematically killing the people they meant to heal. The correspondence between monasteries also helped spread particularly deadly practices across Europe. When monks from different communities shared information about their healing methods, they naturally focused on their apparent successes while downplaying or ignoring their failures. A monastery that had developed an especially toxic preparation might send the recipe to sister institutions, along with glowing reports of its effectiveness that omitted any mention of the patients who had died from its use. These networks of monastic communication created a system where the most dangerous practices could spread rapidly across the continent while being protected from criticism by their religious context. A treatment that killed patients in one monastery would be enthusiastically adopted by others, based on reports that emphasized its spiritual benefits while ignoring its practical consequences. The integration of monastic medicine with the broader religious life of medieval Europe also meant that these deadly practices received endorsement from the highest levels of church hierarchy. Bishops and abbots who visited successful monasteries would often praise their medical work as evidence of God's favor, encouraging other religious communities to adopt similar methods. These ecclesiastical endorsements gave monastic medical practices a level of authority that secular medicine could never achieve. When a bishop declared that a particular monastery's healing methods were blessed by God, questioning those methods became tantamount to heresy. This religious protection made it virtually impossible for anyone to challenge monastic medical practices, no matter how obviously harmful they proved to be. The result was a system of medical care that combined the worst aspects of medieval medicine with additional dangers created by religious fanaticism and institutional isolation. Monastic healers were more dedicated than secular physicians, more convinced of their righteousness, more protected from criticism, and more likely to interpret the failure of their treatments as evidence that they needed to try harder rather than try something different. In the quiet cloisters of medieval monasteries, surrounded by the sound of prayer and the smell of medicinal herbs, some of history's most well-intentioned killers pursued their deadly craft with the absolute certainty that they were doing God's work. They bled patients in the name of spiritual purification, poisoned them with toxic medicines in pursuit of moral cleansing, and watched them die while convinced that they were facilitating their journey to heaven. The bells that called the monks to prayer each day also tolled for the countless patients who died under their care, victims of a medical system that had confused suffering with healing, poison with medicine, and systematic harm with divine intervention. And in the silence that followed each patient's death, the monks would bow their heads in prayer, asking God to bless their continued work of healing the sick, never knowing that their prayers were being answered in the most terrible way possible. The tragedy of medieval medicine reached its most horrific crescendo during the great epidemics that swept across Europe like waves of death, carrying with them not just disease, but the absolute certainty of the medical establishment that they knew how to fight back. When the Black Death arrived in 1347, it found a continent populated by physicians who had spent centuries perfecting their deadly arts, and who met this ultimate test of their knowledge with every tool in their lethal arsenal. Picture the scene in a plague-stricken city like Florence or London. Bodies pile in the streets faster than they can be buried. The air itself seems thick with corruption and death. And into this hellscape stride the physicians, their long robes trailing behind them, their leather satchels filled with instruments of bleeding and bottles of toxic medicine, absolutely convinced that they possessed the knowledge needed to turn back this tide of mortality. They had theories, of course. The plague was clearly caused by a corruption of the air, a miasma that had thrown the entire atmosphere out of balance. The solution was to restore equilibrium through their tried and tested methods. Bloodletting would release the corrupted humours that the poisoned air had generated. Purging would expel the toxic substances that had accumulated in the body. Powerful medicines containing mercury and antimony would burn away the corruption from within. What they created instead was a medical catastrophe layered on top of a natural one. Plague victims, already suffering from high fever, swollen lymph nodes, and internal bleeding, were subjected to treatments that drained away what little strength their bodies had left to fight the infection. Patients who might have had some chance of survival were bled until they were too weak to resist the disease. Those whose immune systems were mounting a desperate defense were purged until they were dehydrated and chemically imbalanced. The physicians worked with desperate intensity, moving from house to house, from patient to patient, applying their methods with the kind of heroic dedication that should have been the stuff of legend. Many of them died in the process, succumbing to the same plague they were trying to treat. But their deaths weren't the result of helplessness in the face of an unstoppable disease. They died because their treatments made both doctor and patient more vulnerable to infection. Consider the case of Guy de Chauliac, the celebrated surgeon we encountered earlier, who treated Pope Clement VI during the plague outbreak in Avignon. Guy was considered one of the finest physicians of his age, a man whose expertise was sought by the most powerful people in Europe. When the plague struck, he didn't flee like many others did. He stayed at his post, treating victim after victim with the same meticulous care he had always applied. His methods were everything medieval medicine had taught him they should be. He bled patients to reduce the fever that the plague had generated. He lanced the swollen buboes that appeared in victims' groins and armpits, believing that draining the corrupt matter would speed healing. He administered powerful medicines designed to expel the poisonous humours from the body. He followed every protocol that centuries of medical tradition had established, and his patients died in staggering numbers. But Guy de Chauliac never questioned his methods. When patients failed to respond to bloodletting, he concluded that they needed more aggressive bleeding. When purging didn't cure them, he prescribed stronger purgatives. When his medicines seemed ineffective, he combined them in more complex and toxic formulations. The possibility that his treatments were making the plague worse never entered his mind, because it literally couldn't exist within the framework of medieval medical thinking. The plague physicians developed increasingly elaborate explanations for why their treatments sometimes failed to work. The corruption in the air was stronger than usual, requiring more intensive intervention. The patients had waited too long before seeking treatment, allowing the imbalance to become too severe to correct. The astrological conditions were unfavourable, interfering with the natural healing process. What they never considered was that the patients who survived the plague were often those who received the least medical attention. In the chaos of the epidemic, many victims were simply left alone to recover or die without intervention. Those lucky enough to be overlooked by the physicians often had better survival rates than those who received the full benefit of medical care. The irony becomes even more bitter when we consider that some plague physicians began to notice this pattern. They observed that patients in remote areas, where medical care was unavailable, sometimes had better outcomes than those in cities with the finest hospitals. But rather than questioning their treatments, they developed theories about how rural air was less corrupted, or how simple peasants had constitutions that were naturally more resistant to the plague. The medical response to the Black Death also reveals how medieval physicians dealt with the obvious failure of their methods. As the death toll mounted, and it became impossible to ignore that their treatments weren't working, they didn't abandon their approach. Instead, they intensified it. Patients were bled more frequently, purged more violently, and given stronger medicines in higher doses. This escalation of treatment created a feedback loop of horror. The sicker patients became from their medical care, the more obvious it seemed that they were suffering from severe corruption that required even more aggressive intervention. Physicians would spend days at a bedside, applying treatment after treatment, watching their patients grow steadily worse, and interpreting each decline as evidence that the disease was more serious than they had initially realized. The plague also brought out the full horror of medieval surgical practice. Physicians believed that the swollen lymph nodes characteristic of bubonic plague needed to be drained to release the corrupt matter within. They would make deep incisions into these buboes, often without any form of pain relief, creating open wounds that inevitably became infected. Patients who might have survived the original disease died from the secondary infections introduced by their surgeons. The surgical instruments used for these procedures were not sterilized between patients. Physicians would move from victim to victim, carrying infected material on their blades and their hands, spreading the disease even as they tried to treat it. The very act of seeking medical care became a way of ensuring exposure to the plague, as hospitals and physicians' chambers became concentrated sources of infection. Medieval physicians also developed special plague medicines that represented the absolute pinnacle of their toxic art. These preparations typically contained mercury, antimony, arsenic, and other poisonous substances in concentrations that could kill a healthy person, let alone someone already weakened by disease. The medicines were often prepared according to elaborate alchemical processes that were supposed to concentrate their healing power, but actually made them more lethal. One popular plague remedy involved heating mercury with sulfur and various plant materials to create a preparation that was believed to be particularly effective against corruption of the blood. Patients who survived the initial dose were often given repeated treatments until they showed signs of improvement, which usually meant mercury poisoning symptoms that the physicians interpreted as evidence that the medicine was working. The psychological impact of these treatments on both patients and physicians created additional layers of tragedy. Patients, desperate for any hope of survival, submitted to procedures that they knew were agonizing in the belief that their suffering was necessary for healing. Families watched loved ones endure torments that seemed worse than the disease itself, but trusted that the learned physicians knew what they were doing. The physicians themselves often worked themselves into states of near madness, trying to save patients who were actually dying from the treatments they were receiving. They would spend sleepless nights preparing new medicines, calculating more precise bloodletting schedules, and consulting astrological charts to determine the optimal timing for their interventions. Their dedication was absolute, their compassion genuine, and their effectiveness catastrophic. Some plague physicians began keeping detailed records of their treatments, trying to identify patterns that might improve their success rates. These records, when they survive, provide a heartbreaking glimpse into minds that were systematically misinterpreting everything they observed. A physician might note that patients who were bled early in their illness seemed to fare better than those who were bled later, not realizing that the early patients were actually dying more quickly and thus suffering less from repeated treatments. The plague also revealed the full extent to which medieval medicine had become disconnected from practical observation. Physicians could watch patient after patient die following the same treatments, see the obvious pattern of failure, and still conclude that they needed to apply their methods more skillfully rather than abandon them entirely. The theoretical framework of humoral medicine was so complete, so internally consistent, that it could explain away any amount of contrary evidence. When the Black Death finally began to subside, not because of medical intervention, but due to the natural course of the epidemic, physicians credited their efforts with eventually bringing the corruption under control. They had persevered through the darkest hours, applied their treatments with unwavering dedication, and finally restored balance to the diseased atmosphere. The fact that millions had died despite their care was simply evidence of how severe the initial imbalance had been. The medical profession emerged from the plague, years with their confidence not shaken, but reinforced. They had faced the ultimate test of their knowledge, and in their own minds had proven equal to the challenge. The treatments that had killed countless plague victims were refined and systematized, ready to be applied to future epidemics with even greater skill and precision. And so the cycle continued, now validated by the ultimate crisis. Medieval medicine had faced its greatest challenge and, from its own perspective, had emerged triumphant. The physicians who survived the plague became the teachers of the next generation, passing on their deadly wisdom to students who would carry it forward into new centuries of systematic harm. The plague years had also created a new class of medical heroes. physicians who had stayed at their posts during the epidemic, treating patient after patient until they themselves succumbed to disease. These martyrs of medicine were held up as examples of the highest professional dedication, their methods sanctified by their willingness to die in service to their patients. The fact that their treatments had probably hastened both their own deaths and those of their patients was lost in the narrative of heroic self-sacrifice. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the medical response to the Black Death was how it demonstrated the complete inability of medieval physicians to learn from catastrophic failure. Even when faced with mortality rates that should have shattered any confidence in their methods, they found ways to interpret their results as validation of everything they believed. The plague became not a refutation of medieval medicine, but its ultimate vindication, proof that their theories were correct and their methods sound. In the years following the plague, medical schools across Europe incorporated the lessons learned during the epidemic into their curricula. Students were taught how to recognize the signs of atmospheric corruption, how to adjust their bloodletting techniques for plague conditions, and how to prepare the powerful medicines that had supposedly helped end the crisis. The treatments that had killed hundreds of thousands became the standard protocols for future epidemics. The Black Death had been medieval medicine's final examination, and in the minds of those who practiced it, they had passed with honors. The stage was now set for centuries more of learned healing that would continue to confuse suffering with treatment, poison with medicine, and systematic harm with the highest expressions of medical art. And in the quiet hours after each day's rounds, as medieval physicians cleaned their blood-stained instruments and prepared their toxic medicines for the next day's patients, they could rest secure in the knowledge that they were carrying on a noble tradition of healing that had proven itself capable of meeting any challenge. The fact that their tradition was actually a systematic method for hastening death remained as hidden from them as it had been from their teachers, and as it would remain for their students in the centuries to come. And so we come to the end of our journey through the shadowed corridors of medieval medicine, where good intentions walked hand in hand with systematic destruction, where learning became a pathway to lethality, and where the very people entrusted with preserving life had unknowingly mastered the art of ending it. Tonight, we've walked alongside physicians who bled their patients to death while believing they were restoring balance, who poisoned the sick with toxic remedies while convinced they were purifying corrupted souls, and who turned hospitals into charnel houses while certain they were creating sanctuaries of healing. These weren't monsters or madmen. They were learned scholars, devoted healers, compassionate human beings who had built their entire understanding of the world on foundations that were not just wrong, but catastrophically, systematically, lethally wrong. The most haunting truth we've uncovered is that intelligence, education, and genuine compassion are not enough to prevent us from causing tremendous harm when we're operating from flawed assumptions. The medieval physicians who bled plague victims until they died weren't evil. They were trapped within a system of knowledge so complete, so internally consistent, that it could explain away any amount of suffering while demanding ever more aggressive intervention. Their story whispers to us across the centuries, a reminder that certainty can be more dangerous than ignorance, that systematic wrongness can be more deadly than random chance, and that the line between healing and harming is often drawn not by our intentions, but by our willingness to question what we think we know. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you'll find some comfort in knowing that you live in an age when medicine has learned, slowly and painfully, to test its assumptions against reality. But perhaps you'll also carry with you a quiet unease, a gentle reminder that human knowledge is always provisional, always incomplete, and that the greatest dangers often come not from what we don't know, but from what we're absolutely certain we do. Sleep well, knowing that the medieval physicians who haunt these pages were not so different from us. They simply lived in a time when the best minds of the age had built their understanding on foundations of sand and convinced themselves they were standing on solid ground. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be undisturbed by the whispered question that follows us all through the darkness. What are we wrong about now?